Hey guys, Loco here. Today we're going to talk about tanks and why tanks used to be everywhere and they're nowhere to be found now. What the hell happened and why is it so, and why we're probably never going to see tanks again dominate the meta. So, long time ago, tanks used to be such a core part of the meta. You would see them in jungle, you would see them in top lane, you would see them a lot in support. Luckily, we still see them a lot in support. But nowadays, we barely see tanks anywhere, especially in solo lanes for top and mid. Traditionally, mid tanks aren't really a thing. I know, we've seen Ornn mid, we've seen Sion mid, but that's more of an anomaly than an actual real thing that Riot wants to be a thing and wants to be meta. And there's three primary reasons why we just don't see tanks as much. First one is the meta shift. The meta is shifting away from tanks. We'll go into that more in detail. And second one is the rise of the tank buster champion. I think 3 champions specifically are really a big part of the meta in the last few years, and they have pushed out tanks and made it really unattractive for pro players to pick up and play tanks. And third of all, this one you probably didn't guess, is Riot does not want you guys to be playing tanks. Riot doesn't even want pro players to be playing tanks. And yeah, I'll explain everything right now. First of all, let's try to define what a tank is. What is a tank? So according to Riot definition, tanks are tough melee champions who sacrifice damage for CC. They're also low mobility, and they'll have skills that will make them more tanky. Duh, they're called tanks. I think classically, I agree with the definition that Riot has for tanks. I mean, in most games, you find tanks are these like beef, gigantic champions or characters or heroes, whatever the hell you want to call it, that can soak up a lot of damage, and they'll be able to CC people or crowd control people. Traditionally, tanks have these skills called taunt to like peel aggro off of people, like you can see in WoW, like you build threat. And in other games, tanks also just, like taunt people and force people to attack you. And that's kind of how tanks function. They're these like beefy, gigantic champions that don't do a lot of damage by themselves, and they also have low mobility. And when they're on top of you, it's not like they're doing a lot of damage, they're doing low amount of consistent damage, and they force you to deal with you by either CCing you or taunting you. Tanks are obnoxious giant champions that tell you, hey, you can't do whatever you want to do and you need to come deal with me, and I'm going to be very hard to deal with and kill with because I'm going to be tanky. That's just what tanks are in games. One thing that's been really interesting with how Riot defines tanks is there's 2 classes that tanks are supposed to be good against and 2 classes that tanks are supposed to be bad against. So 2 classes tanks are supposed to be good against are assassins and mages. Basically, it goes something like assassins and mages are bursty types of champion, and when you try to burst down a tank counters that. And then the 2 class of champions that tanks are supposed to be bad versus are AD carries or marksmen, and fighters or bruisers. Like, I don't know why Riot wants to call AD carries marksmen and bruisers fighters, but that is like the official Riot term. So yeah, tanks are supposed to be bad versus bruisers and marksmen. And it's because both these classes do a lot of DPS. They do good damage over time, and that's supposed to counter tanks. I agree with like most of it. Like, assassins are bad versus tanks, like AD carries and bruisers are good versus tanks, but the mage one is a little tricky. So let's examine that one a little bit more in detail. So what happens a lot of times when mages and tanks go up in lane, the mages are range champions, they have better wave clear, and they'll get priority on the tanks. Unless the tank is something like a Sion who also has good wave clear, but most of the time the mages beat tanks in lane, which is a huge thing in competitive play, and just even in normal solo queue rank play. Being able to move around the map first, and being able to reset first, being able to go to scuttle first, being able to roam bottom first, or roam top or invade jungle, whatever the hell you want, being able to get lane priority first is a huge fundamental part of the game. And yeah, tanks just don't do a great job of that, and mages are able to beat tanks out that way. Another really good interaction for mages versus tanks is mages have a lot of damage, and in League of Legends, champions aren't really gated by mana once you get to 1 or 2 items. So long as they can maintain that distance and constantly poke down the tank, it doesn't really matter if the tank is like tanky. The tank's counterplay is to be able to engage on the mage, and depending on how you use flash and depending on how you maintain distance, a lot of times the mage actually ends up coming out ahead. So yes, I understand in a very isolated, in a vacuum, a tank can beat a mage in a team fight because the tank soaked up all the mage's damage, but most of the situations, I feel like, tanks just do not do well versus mages. Now let's get into the reasons why the meta has been shifting away from tanks. The first thing is bruisers up in top lane, and that's where we're really going to talk about tanks being played in top lane. We're going to get to the support part in a little bit, but look at the list of champions that's been really popular in the last 2 years. Aatrox, Irelia, Renekton, Gangplank, Sylas, all these champions do so well versus tanks. Aatrox is basically a melee Vladimir, so naturally he does really well versus tanks. Irelia, a lot of damage, can easily set up for junglers. Renekton, same thing as Irelia, can set up even easier for junglers and also has very consistent damage. Once you start getting doughed by Renekton as a tank, you're kind of screwed for the rest of the game. Gangplank, consistent damage. He can also get himself outside of CC by just using his W, which is tank's primary tool. And also, Gangplank in general has armor pen and he scales really nicely into tanks, so he can be as good as tanks in team fights or even stronger, and he definitely beats most tank in a split push situation. Another nightmares champion to deal with. Sylas, consistent damage, CC, you get to restore HP with your W, and also tanks normally have extremely powerful ultimate at the cost of having weak Q, W, and E, and whenever Sylas steals your ultimate, my god does it feel bad as a tank. Whenever Sylas steals Malphite ult, oh my goodness, that is disgusting. So yeah, all these champions, like all these bruisers, AP bruisers, AD bruisers dominating top lane just push tanks out so much. And another one is like the mages up in top lane, Vladimir and Rides. These champions beat tanks in lane naturally, and they also scale better than tanks in team fights also, and in split push situations, so they just screw tanks in both ways. Like, they perform different roles than tanks in team fights, but they just are a bigger threat and a bigger win condition than tanks. So yeah, it doesn't really make sense to play tanks into these champions either. So it's kind of hard to even blind pick a tank nowadays with all these like dangerous champions you can play versus. And the other huge problem that we talked about, like being a win condition for the team and also what happens later on, all these aspects just don't do well for tanks. And another one is, most of the tanks we see nowadays are being played in support for bot lane, right? So here's the problem with that. Whenever there's champions like Nautilus, Leona, Braum, Alistar, when these champions are being played in bot lane, they're doing the roles of the top lane tanks, and they aren't really true tanks. These are more of what I would say are utility champions that has the ability to be tanky and engage in team fights and protect teammates, which is what a tank is supposed to do, but these champions are just doing it at a low resource, like a low cost way from bot lane. So yeah, it makes no sense to play any tanky champion in solo lanes really. And the only tank that really sees play from my opinion nowadays is Ornn, and it's because this champion is just giga OP and the numbers are so busted in terms of scaling once you get to that upgrading item breaking point. That's the only real reason Ornn gets played. Like, it's not because he's a good tank, it's because he's a good champion. And then the other champion that kind of saw play was Sejuani, and that champion was just so busted in terms of like how tanky you can be. If the bar of this, you need to be this good to see play as a tank is like Sejuani Ornn level, then yeah, it's just not going to come into fruition because these are incredibly OP champions that Riot will probably not balance around. Like, they aren't going to make tanks that strong. Also, finally, one other thing I want to talk about in terms of meta shift is AD carries kind of suck right now, and AD carries and tanks play a really interesting role. AD carries love playing versus tanks. They're very kiteable, they don't do a lot of damage to you. Well, sometimes. Some of the tanky champions in League of Legends do a lot of damage. But that aside, yeah, AD carries also play very well with tanks. Whenever tanks are there, they peel for you, they engage for you, they set up team fight really nicely for you. But due to how random and sporadic the game has been and how much it's been about vision control and taking like small skirmishes more so than these like proper 5v5 team fights, like AD carries have been losing power. And by the same sense, tanks have been losing power too. Because if it's not these like proper 5v5 team fights, tanks just don't have a space. So yeah, AD carries kind of suck, and tanks along with them suck together. Think of it this way, tank is like a giant shield and an AD carry is a sword. So in like a proper fight, like you put your shield up and like you hack and slash people, and these like bruiser type, mage type champions are like dual wielding daggers, and right now the dual wielding daggers are just smashing these like proper, like I have my shield up, sword up fighters by like stabbing them in the back, stabbing them when they don't even see them coming. So yeah, tanks no bueno. Now, I want to talk about 3 champions that I think are incredible tank busters. Akali, Xayah, and Kai'Sa. Oh man, Akali. She's getting nerfed in the next patch, so that's good. Maybe we won't see as much Akali. But this is an assassin champion that does incredibly well versus tanks. So normally, tanks are supposed to be able to survive the burst of assassins, especially in lane situation, right? But champions like Akali are based on energy, and they can wave clear so efficiently. So yeah, that's just not really gonna fly. Also, she has so much mobility, it's incredibly hard to lock her down even with CC due to her W. Yeah, like the tank's job is to be able to lock down assassins and soak their damage. What happens if the assassin has infinite damage potential and has so much mobility and evasiveness that the tanks aren't able to lock her down, then you get, the Akali situation, an assassin that can play well versus tanks. And then the two AD carries I mentioned, Xayah and Kai'Sa. Wait! So Xayah and Kai'Sa are not traditional AD carries. These are AD carries that break rules of being AD carries. Like, the AD carries aren't supposed to have this much playmaking tools. AD carries aren't supposed to be able to build Zhonya's, and that's exactly what Kai'Sa does. Her damage profile is so exquisite. Like, she can be full AP, she can be on hit, she can be traditional AD carry, she can be crit. And also she has access to Zhonya, so she can negate a lot of the tank CC. She has Invis, the notorious tank buster champion. Before this was Vayne. Now Kai'Sa has a lot of the tools that Vayne used to have. Percentage damage from her passive, and also her ultimate. If a team fight is started, Kai'Sa is able to join it instantly and not really have to worry about getting CC'd by a tank doing like a proper team fight. So yeah, she has so much backline access. So what can tanks do, really? And then when we get to Xayah, here's the big thing with tanks and AD carries, right? So the tank will set up for other people on your team to do damage to the AD carry by landing good CC on the enemy champion. Like Malphite being able to ult a Jinx and knocking up the Jinx, so the Jinx is very easy to kill for the rest of your team. What if that Jinx has the ability to make herself invulnerable? Well, it's going to be really hard to do your job as Malphite, right? But what if that Jinx had the ability to be invulnerable and also just do a lot of damage at the same time, like normal, and still be able to CC you with feathers? And that's kind of what Xayah is. Xayah is a hyper carry. She does have lower range than other champions, but it doesn't matter that much. She has so much burst, she has so much CC potential with her E, and most importantly, her ultimate being able to dodge CC makes her a perfect champion to be playing versus tanks. So yeah, tanks aren't having a lot of fun with Xayah, Kai'Sa, Akali dominating the meta. And then the last detail, this one might catch a lot of you guys by surprise, but Riot doesn't want you guys playing tanks. Tanks are incredibly boring to play. Pro players don't really want to play tanks unless they really need to. And even when they really need to, some pro players will do everything in their power to not play tanks. I think a great example of this is Huni. My god, this guy just hates playing tanks. It doesn't matter what meta, he'll find a way to be carry oriented. And because, you know, when you play a tank, a lot of the game isn't in your control. You're not very strong in lane, you're not really strong individually in team fights, you're just setting up for other people. It's just not a fun role to play. So all these like bruisers and carry champions coming out and doing well versus tanks, and Riot not doing a really proactive job of buffing tanks or giving them items or giving them overall class rework so they see a lot more playing. Does anyone remember like the Maokai, Sion, like all that Shen, all that Mundo, Poppy, all that like gross tanky meta? Riot doesn't like that. The game isn't very exciting to watch in pro play when it's two tanks noodling up in team fights. Riot loves all these bruisers, assassins, mages being played. It's so much more flashier. You watch a really good Akali player, you watch a really good Vladimir player, Irelia player, and you want to go out and play those champions. When you see a really good Maokai or a Shen player, I mean, you'll appreciate it, but it doesn't want you to, you know, play more League of Legends. So it's not really a thing. Riot's completely fine with tanks being shit. It doesn't make monetary sense. It doesn't make sense for pro play. It basically just doesn't make sense for anyone other than like dedicated tank players for there to be a lot of tank play in games. So yeah, no one wants you guys to be playing tanks. And that's why for the foreseeable future, I don't think we're going to get a primary tank meta. And I think it's okay that we don't see tanks probably ever again. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I have this new YouTube setup with lights and like my mic out of the way and a DSLR. Am I like uglier on camera now? I hope not. Anyways, don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment. I'm going to be doing so much more content. I really want to be able to do daily videos, so show the love. I also want to do non-esport content like this that kind of has the vibe of esports, but not really. So show the love down in the comments. Like, subscribe, share this video with your mom, with your friends, with your grandma, with your girlfriend. JK, you don't have a girlfriend, just share this video. And one last thing, I'm not crazy, I'm just Loco. Later.